I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I want you to get very, very excited about your brain and very excited about the projections from your brain all the way down to your muscles. We're going to think about how they control and drive our movement. And as physiotherapists, with just a little bit of understanding of neuroscience, how we can use this information to change our clinical practice. So this is well within our skill set to modulate our motor cortex, and that's really exciting. Before we start, I do have a disclosure. We published a paper called Tendon neuroplastic training, and within that we provided all of the information about how to do this. And then the feedback that we got from patients and clinicians was that it was a bit time-consuming to do, even though the strategies are quite simple. So we've developed an app. Now, we're going to be using this app in research, but I'm going to talk about it today as well clinically. So it makes TNT easy for clinicians and patients. We're launching it next year. And the reason why I have a disclosure is I've picked out an Audi down the road, and I think if enough people buy the app, that's possible. I also really like shoes, as Mario will know, so it's also very possible that I will spend any earnings from the app on some lovely shoes that I found in Zurich. Okay. So the app is called Tendon, and hopefully it's something that makes your clinical practice easy. Having said that, I'm going to give you all the information today. You don't need to buy this app. This is something that you can do. So TNT, first we need to think, what is it? Why is it important? And critically, how do we do it? So what underpins TNT is an understanding of the neuroscience. So work your attention all the way up to your motor cortex. Reacquaint yourself with your little motor homunculus, your little version of you in the brain doing a bit of a backflip. All of your movements are represented on your motor cortex. And the way we control movement is a balance between the excitability and the inhibition. And you can think of that excitability like the accelerator of a car. And you can think of your inhibition like the brake of a car. So every movement that you do is a balance between that accelerator and that brake. And that's a really critical thing to understand. So TNT is neuroscience enhanced exercise. It's a way of modulating our primary motor cortex by using stimuli that connect the auditory and the visual cortex with our motor cortex during exercise. Now, critically, this actually changes excitability, inhibition, and accuracy of movement, or we can call this neuroplasticity. That's what we're doing. We're changing brains. Why might this be important? And Jill has spoken about some of the pitfalls with current rehabilitation, but just to run you through what they are, the best evidence is for load, but as Jill said, it doesn't necessarily retrain our energy storage or the capacity that person needs. So we need to ask, is a strength training program enough? Do we adequately address function? You'll hear that a lot from us today, and that's on purpose. We're trying to really change the way you think about function. And what I'm interested in is how can we incorporate neuroscience to better address all of the deficits from tendon, muscle, kinetic chain, and brain. So this wonderful slide that Craig Purdon put together, we're showing you several times because there's so many great clinical messages from this. If you do a leg press, a double leg press, and then you land from a jump, and then you land in a stop jump sequence, which is when you approach a volleyball net, what you see is that the tensile load on the patellar tendon, which is in red, is actually quite similar through those activities. But as you add speed, you increase that rate of loading substantially. So the clinical implications from this data slide are really rich. We have a rationale for objective measures for our athletes. If you want to jump and land and play volleyball, you need to be super strong. We actually need to make sure that we have adequately ticked off the strength phase, but we can't stop there. What we need to do is make sure that we progressively add energy storage loads back up to whatever your desired function is. And Craig's going to illustrate that with the hamstring tendon later on. It also, as a little clinical note, reminds us why we can't add load with speed. So what I mean by that is you can't add additional weight and get people to do plyometric activities, because adding speed adds substantial load to our tendons, and that's why we keep our strength phase quite separate to our energy storage phase. But for me, the light bulb here was that we cannot stop at strength. We can't do a heavy, slow resistance protocol and then return someone to an energy storage environment. It's too big a change for the tendon. So strength training is critical, but it may not be enough. What about our motor drive? Let's work back up to our brains. So you can actually look at the motor drive. You can look at your brake and your accelerator using some equipment called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And what you do is you put a magnetic coil over your motor cortex in the area that represents your leg extension, if you're interested in the patellar tendon. And what I do, I give you a very friendly zap. And this zap travels down your corticospinal tract, and we record it as a twitch in the target muscle, so in this case, in our quadriceps. Now, what I do, I, in a very friendly way, increase the intensity of this zap. So I give you a bigger and bigger and bigger zap so that we get a bigger response from your muscle. Using this technique, we can look at both our accelerator and our brake. So what did we find in the patellar tendon? Well, we know that the patellar tendon, we know that tendinopathy appears to have features of a local nociceptive driver, but it's a very persistent condition. So we were interested in what the motor cortex response to having patellar tendon pain was. This is what we found. If we consider first our accelerator, this is our excitability. As I increase the intensity of the stimulus, I turn up the zap, what you get is a really lovely sigmoidal curve in controlled jumping participants. So people without pain or pathology have this wonderful modulation of their response as you ask more of their motor cortex. People with patellar tendon pain had nothing, bang. They switched everything on and then they plateaued. They had a really different profile. They had no ability to modulate this response. And we call this increased excitability. So their accelerator is stuck on. What about the inhibition? So in a separate study, we looked at the amount of brake. And what we found is that people with patellar tendinopathy have tons of inhibition. Their brain is saying, don't use your quadriceps, don't use your quadriceps. So what that means is we have one foot stuck on the accelerator and one foot stuck on the brake. Now, I'm sure drivers in Switzerland are very good, but learner drivers in Australia are terrible. So the analogy that we have used is that these people drive like a learner driver, with one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake. They have a really different profile. And the physiotherapist in me, this was my first study of my PhD, thought, do we do anything about that when we give exercise? Or are we just kind of focused on the tendon and the muscle? And that's sort of where TNT started. So we know that load can change these things, and these things are what are altered in tendinopathy. Tendinopathy is complex. People have pain, they have changes to function, as Jill said, and we now know that they've got changes to their motor drive, their brake and their accelerator. So load sits over here. Load can change pain and function. How do we hit this bullseye? How do we use neuroscience to hit the bullseye? To explain that, I'm going to use a wonderful study from Mike Luong. This is from his PhD. And if you're even just a little bit excited about neuroplasticity, please read this paper. It's brilliant. So he compared a number of different conditions. The first one he looked at is self-paced strength. Now, self-paced strength is what we currently prescribe. We ask our athletes or our patients to go off to the gym, and I went off to the gym last night and I sat on the leg extension machine. I was very focused, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do 4 lots of 6. And I started, and then I thought, I love fondue. I wonder what's for dinner. How many have I done? And this is what our patients do. They lose focus, or the music's blaring at a lot of our gyms, And this is self-paced strength. Now, your athletes and your patients will get stronger. You will get physiological changes to the muscle and the tendon, but you don't change your motor drive. You don't get changes to your brake and your accelerator. If you do a visuomotor skill, now that's where you have, say, a mechanical arm and you watch the screen and you copy the movement exactly for the speed and for the range of movement. You're very, very focused. This is called visuomotor training. You get a ton of plasticity. You get changes to your brake and your accelerator. The third condition that he compared was metronome-based strength. Now, this is where you send your athlete or your patient off to the gym, but they are listening to an auditory cue while they're performing the movement. This not only guarantees the time under tension and the exercise prescription that you would like, you actually get changes to your brake and your accelerator. This was a real light bulb for me. Repetitive, unskilled movements do not result in changes to the motor cortex. I just thought if you did something enough, you would get changes. It's really important as physiotherapists we understand that it's actually not just about repetition. So let's put all that together now in the context of our available interventions. If we look at a passive intervention, we've done nothing to address the strength of the tendon or the muscle or the kinetic chain. We haven't addressed our motor drive, our brake and our accelerator. So we really cannot be surprised that there's no magic bullet. When you consider what our passive interventions address, it's really simple to see why there is no simple solution for such a complex condition. What about if we do strength training and loading is what most of us do, and there are different protocols and we all might do it differently, but that's our goal. We're trying to load our athletes and our patients. But if we're doing this in a self-paced way, we haven't addressed our brake and our accelerator. So whilst we're not failing, this is our current clinical challenge where tendinopathy is really hard to treat. It takes a long time. It often comes back. You can see problems on the other side. So can we do better? What about if we say, well, we won't worry at all about the strength. That funny lady from Australia banged on about the brain quite a bit. So maybe we'll just do some sort of motor drive training. Maybe we'll just visualise or do some skilled movement. Well, what we would say is that that's clearly not going to be a solution either, because we actually need capacity in tendon, muscle, kinetic chain to absorb the force and achieve our goal. So TNT is putting this all together, where we use our strength and our kinetic chain loading programs that are based on what we know is good for tendon and muscle. We pace it with an external stimulus or a visual stimulus, and our optimal outcome is trying to address all levels of dysfunction. The research for this is abundant in other areas of research. So in neuroscience, exercise is often paired with external pacing, but there's nothing in musculoskeletal literature other than what we have published, which I'll show you now. So I'm trying to subliminal messaging for a car. So what's the evidence for tendons in season using TNT? We looked at two protocols, an isometric condition and an isotonic condition. They were both effective. That's brilliant. You have two options for treating tendinopathy in season. You can provide people with an isometric contraction or an isotonic contraction. They're both very effective. We chose a 4-week intervention because I wasn't interested in changing muscle strength. I was interested in changing motor drive, and that is predominantly happens in the first 4 weeks. The isometrics gave a greater analgesic effect immediately, and I'll talk through that later on this afternoon. So how do I know which one to choose? Your change in pain in the first week was moderately correlated with your change in visa-P at week 4. So clinically, you could give someone a week of one of the protocols and have a very good indication of whether or not that was going to be the right one for them. You don't have to wait around for 4 weeks. We saw some of the athletes were kind enough to let me zap their brain every week, and we see that this process takes about 4 weeks to normalise their corticospinal excitability. We also see the same with inhibition. So TNT changes both the accelerator and the brake. Now, this is how you might do it clinically, and this is how we were doing it prior to the app. The metronome speed is 60 beats per minute. That's important. That fires up both sides of your brain. You need a slightly longer eccentric component. That's important for firing up your frontal lobe and the planning. So all of these decisions are about engaging your whole brain. The protocol that we use for isometric is 5 by 45 seconds, and the protocol for isotonic's up on the screen. And we would make a recording where people listen to the metronome with instructions. And clinicians said, well, that takes me too long to make a file for all of my patients. Can you do it? So we did. So this is TNT, but it's kind of TNT supercharged, to borrow Lorimer and David's words. And that's because we're asking people to enter some very basic information about themselves so that they will recognise self. So we have used athletes of different skin colour, used people with different accents, so we have American English, Australian English, so that at the start you enter some basic information so that what you hear and what you see is as important as the exercise that you're doing. So we're doing not only the auditory cue, but it's visuomotor training, because you will actually copy with the person on the screen in real time. I'm not very fancy with videos, so there's still pictures, but I think I've got it on my phone if anyone's interested. At the moment, we're doing this in our early stage rehabilitation. So Jill described our 4 stages. We're doing it in our isometric condition and our isotonic condition. It's currently only in English. Speaking another language in Australia is really uncommon, so it's really difficult for us at the moment to get this translated. And what you see is different views. So these bird's eye views, these front-on views, to really make sure there's attention to the task. So I really commonly get asked, can you self-pace? If you really focus at the gym, if you don't think about fondue, is that going to be okay? Well, the evidence would say no, that you actually need that predictable stimulus and the auditory stimulus for this to be effective. I also get asked, can you use music? Probably. But the tempo is important and the predictability is important. So it isn't a distraction. It's not about blasting music at you. It's quite different. Think about it as mindfulness for strength training. And critically, the external rhythm actually needs to be relevant to the task. Where they've looked at pacing in high-level runners, it actually makes their performance worse. So you have to make sure that it's relevant for the person in front of you. We also get asked, can you use visual cues? Now, the research into visual cues has been mainly into conditions like Parkinson's, where they've used a step cue to try and increase step length. And so it's difficult to know how much you can translate that into our athletic population without neurological disease. But what we do know is that these really strong projections between the visual cortex and the motor cortex and the auditory cortex and the motor cortex. So if we can optimise that with visuomotor training at the same time as our exercise, then, perhaps this is TNT supercharged. How is this being used clinically? The Australian Ballet are amazing, and Sue Mays has started using this in Achilles tendinopathy, and not just during strength training, but they might do a stair climb and ascent and descent on the stairs listening to the metronome. And what they do is they increase the pace, the tempo of the beat, and they do that up to the speed of Piedi Allegro, because then they know that their dancers are safe to go back into class. They've smoothed out that transition between rehabilitation and return to class. So you can start to get creative with your athletes about how you might actually implement this. I think it's going to be very specific to the sport. Now, there's some other little gifts in the neuroscience bag that are just fantastic for physiotherapists. Cross-education is the concept of strength training on one side and getting a transfer of strength to the other side. Now, there's a few things that are really important. It actually needs to be heavy. It needs to be high force for this to be effective. This process is augmented, it's enhanced by our external pacing, so by something like TNT. But it means that in tendons, we can independently train each side. We can use our unaffected side to really kickstart, especially in the early phases, our strength transfer. We do our strength training single leg. Well, that's perfect because not only are we optimising cross-education, most athletic activity you actually do on one side and then the other, such as running. If we put all this together, as Jill said, we don't know the nociceptive driver. We don't know, and even if we did, just changing pain doesn't change any of these wonderful other challenges that we have. Tendinopathy is a hugely complex condition. We know there are changes at the brain, the muscle, the kinetic chain, the tendon. But I do want to remind you to be really careful with your language. As Jill said, we don't want to be talking about, the pathology because people will be too scared to load. And loading is our best tool that we have in our toolbox as physiotherapists. We just have to understand how to apply it. Exercise is medicine, and I hope that you all are inspired about neuroscience. Neuroscience is awesome, and it's a tool that we can use in our clinical practice. So just to finish up, how might we put all of this together? We need to do a loading intervention. We advocate that loading intervention, where possible, is single leg. You need sufficient strength and load distribution across the kinetic chain. To do that, you need to understand their required function, and Jill's going to cover that off really beautifully later, so means you have to stick around the whole day. Cross-education is a great tool to be able to use the brain to strength train the other side. And if you use external pacing during loading, you not only guarantee your time under tension and the load, but you actually get changes to your brake and your accelerator. And we think this might be a really critical thing that we need to address as physiotherapists, and we're the best profession to address this. So this is the summary slide. Sorry for all of you photographing all the ones individually. So we'll talk more about analgesic loads later, but cross-education is a great skill that you can use. External pacing and the visuomotor training. If you wanted to make a video of your patients doing the exercise with the external cue, you absolutely could. We use progressive loading. I'm so thrilled to be here. I want to sincerely thank you all for your attention and for the amazing hospitality that we've had. I really like cheese. Thank you.